Have you ever wondered if the quietest towns hold the darkest secrets? My name is Daniel, and I never thought my military training would be tested in my own hometown of Warren, Vermont. This isn't a story about war, but about something far more unsettling. It's about the day I discovered that the people you trust the most can hide the most terrifying secrets. If it could happen to me, it could happen to anyone. Returning to Warren, Vermont, after years of service felt like stepping into a time capsule. The town hadn't changed much. Same old main street with the general store, the small post office, and the bar where I'd spent too many nights in my youth. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, or at least I thought they did. I came back to Vermont to find some peace, to recover from what I'd seen overseas. My parents had passed while I was gone, leaving me their old farmhouse just outside town. The house was a bit run down, but it had good bones. I figured fixing it up would keep my mind busy, give me something to focus on other than the memories that kept me awake at night. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent most of my time working on the house or driving into town for supplies. The people were friendly enough, though they didn't pry too much. I appreciated that. Small talk at the hardware store was the closest I came to real conversation, and even then, it was mostly about the weather or the price of lumber. One afternoon, as I was picking up some paint at the hardware store, I ran into an old high school friend, Mike. He hadn't changed much. Same scruffy beard, same worn-out baseball cap. We caught up over a couple of beers at the bar, reminiscing about the old days, the mischief we got into as kids. It was good to see a familiar face. After a few drinks, Mike got quiet, his eyes fixed on his beer. I asked him what was on his mind, and that's when he told me about the Veterans Club that met every Friday night. It wasn't official, more of a word-of-mouth thing, held at one of the guys' places on the edge of town. Just a group of former soldiers getting together to talk, to support each other. Mike said I should come by, that it might do me some good. I wasn't sure at first. The idea of sharing my experiences with a bunch of strangers didn't sit right with me. But Mike insisted, saying it wasn't like that. We don't talk about the war much, he said. It's more about just being around people who get it, you know? I figured, why not? It couldn't hurt. Maybe it would even help. So, the following Friday, I drove out to the address Mike gave me. It was a small, nondescript house, set back from the road, surrounded by thick woods. As I pulled up, I noticed there were more cars than I expected, and all of them were parked out of sight from the road. Something about it felt off, but I shook it off as nerves. As I walked up to the house, I could hear the low murmur of voices inside. I knocked on the door, and a tall guy with a buzz cut answered. He looked me up and down, then gave a nod of recognition, stepping aside to let me in. The place was packed, but it was quiet. Too quiet for a gathering of soldiers. The room was dimly lit, with thick curtains drawn tight over the windows. Men sat in a rough circle, nursing beers and staring into space. A few of them glanced up as I entered, their expressions unreadable. I found an empty chair near Mike, who gave me a half-hearted smile. "Glad you made it," he said, but there was something in his voice that didn't match the words. Before I could respond, one of the men across the room spoke up, his voice gravelly and deep. "New guy, huh?" he said. "Welcome to the club." There was no warmth in his welcome, no sense of camaraderie. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just walked into something I wasn't supposed to be part of. I sat down, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. The room smelled of stale beer and something else I couldn't quite place. Maybe fear, maybe something worse. The conversations were sparse, punctuated by long silences. It wasn't the lively, supportive group Mike had described. Instead, it felt more like a secret council, heavy with unspoken words. As the evening wore on, I noticed patterns. Certain topics were avoided, and whenever I tried to steer the conversation toward lighter subjects, I was met with curt responses or cold stares. The men seemed more interested in discussing local politics, specifically grievances against the town council and law enforcement. Their words were laced with bitterness, a simmering resentment that made me uneasy. At one point, the man with the gravelly voice, who I later learned was named Carl, stood up to address the group. He spoke about the injustices faced by veterans, about how the government had failed them. His words were met with nods and murmurs of agreement. While I shared some of his sentiments, the intensity of his anger felt misplaced, almost dangerous. Then, Carl's tone shifted. He began talking about taking matters into their own hands, about reclaiming what was rightfully theirs. The room grew quieter, the air thick with tension. I glanced at Mike, whose eyes were fixed on the floor. It was then I realized this wasn't just a support group. It was something else entirely. I felt a surge of adrenaline, my instincts kicking in. This gathering had undertones of a militia, or worse. The concealed firearms some of the men carried became more apparent. The strategic positioning of seats, the guarded way they spoke, it all added up. When the meeting finally adjourned, I made a beeline for the door. Mike caught up with me outside, his face pale. "Look, I didn't know it would be like this tonight," he said, avoiding my gaze. "It's not usually so intense." I looked at him, searching for sincerity. "Mike, what the hell is this? This isn't just a veterans club." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I thought it would help you, help us. Things have been rough around here. People are looking for answers, for action." "Action?" I echoed, disbelief creeping into my voice. "What kind of action?" He hesitated, then muttered, "Just making sure we're taken care of." I shook my head, the realization hitting me hard. This was more than I bargained for. I told Mike I needed to think and walked to my car, the cold Vermont air biting at my face. As I drove home, headlights cutting through the dark woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I just stepped into something dangerous, something that could spiral out of control. The next few days were a blur of conflicting emotions. On the one hand, I was grateful to be back in the familiarity of Warren, but on the other, I couldn't shake the unsettling experience from the veterans meeting. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I actually knew about the men who attended. I wondered how many others in town were aware of this group, and if they did, what they thought about it. Despite my reservations, I couldn't completely dismiss the group. A part of me understood their frustration. After all, returning to civilian life hadn't been easy for me either. The world had moved on while I was gone, and I often felt like I was struggling to catch up. But the idea of taking action, as Carl had put it, whatever that meant, wasn't something I was ready to get involved in. Mike came by the house a few days later, bringing a six-pack of beer as a peace offering. We sat on the porch, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard. At first, we talked about mundane things, the renovations I was doing on the house, the upcoming hunting season, the usual small-town chatter. But eventually, the conversation drifted back to the group. "You didn't come back last Friday," Mike said, his tone casual, but I could hear the underlying tension. "Yeah, I needed some time to think," I replied, choosing my words carefully. "Mike, I'm not sure that's the kind of place for me. It feels off." He took a long sip of his beer before answering. "I get it, man. It's not for everyone. But we're not doing anything wrong. Just a bunch of guys trying to look out for each other." "Look out for each other? Or stir up trouble?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Mike flinched, then set his beer down, leaning forward. "Dan, you know me. I wouldn't get involved in anything stupid. But things aren't great around here. The town's gone to hell since you left. Jobs are drying up, crime's on the rise, and the cops don't give a damn. Someone's gotta do something." "Sure, but what you guys are talking about sounds more like vigilante justice," I said, keeping my tone measured. "That's a slippery slope, Mike." He stared at me, his eyes hard. "You weren't there, Dan. You don't know what it's like, day in and day out, seeing this town rot away. We're just trying to protect what's ours." I wanted to argue, to tell him that this wasn't the way to do it, but I could see he was too far in. I wasn't going to change his mind. So, I shifted the conversation, trying to steer it away from the group, back to safer topics. But the damage was done. The unease lingered between us. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Mike stood to leave. He hesitated at the door, then turned back to me. "Just think about it, okay? We could really use someone like you. Someone with your skills." He left without another word, leaving me alone on the porch, the weight of his words pressing down on me. My skills. It had been a long time since I thought of myself in those terms, but I knew what he meant. He wasn't talking about home renovation or hunting. He was talking about the things I had learned in the military, things I'd hoped to leave behind. That night, sleep eluded me. I tossed and turned, my mind replaying the conversation over and over. What had Mike gotten himself into? And more importantly, what was I going to do about it? I couldn't just ignore it, but I wasn't ready to get involved either. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I was walking a fine line between loyalty to an old friend and the nagging sense that something very wrong was brewing in Warren. The following week, I kept to myself, avoiding both the town and the group. I threw myself into fixing up the house, trying to focus on anything but the uneasy feeling gnawing at me. But no matter how hard I worked, I couldn't shake the sense that something was about to happen. Something bad. On Thursday, I decided to head into town to pick up more supplies. As I pulled into the parking lot of the hardware store, I noticed a couple of squad cars parked outside the sheriff's office across the street. It wasn't unusual to see the cops around, but today there was an edge to their presence. Officers moving quickly, their expressions serious. Something was up. Inside the hardware store, the atmosphere was tense. The usual chatter was absent, replaced by hushed conversations and wary glances. As I grabbed what I needed, I overheard bits and pieces of a conversation between two men near the register. Found him out by the old mill. Real mess. Sheriff's keeping it quiet, but word's getting around. Could be connected to those break-ins last month. I paid for my supplies and headed back to my truck, my mind racing. Something had gone down, something serious. The old mill was on the outskirts of town, not far from where the veterans group met. I couldn't help but wonder if there was a connection. When I got home, I tried to focus on the work at hand, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the hardware store, to the ominous snippets of conversation I'd overheard. Eventually, I gave in and called Mike. His phone rang and rang, but there was no answer. I left a message, trying to sound casual, but I could hear the worry in my own voice. The next morning, I woke to the sound of someone pounding on my door. Groggy and disoriented, I stumbled to the front door and opened it to find Sheriff Coleman standing there, his face grim. "Dan, we need to talk," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. I stepped aside to let him in, my heart pounding. He walked into the living room, his eyes scanning the room as if assessing a threat. "What's going on, Sheriff?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "You hear about what happened out at the old mill?" "Just bits and pieces," I replied, my stomach twisting. "What's this about?" "Carl Hastings," he said, watching my reaction closely. "Found dead yesterday morning. Looks like he was beaten pretty badly before someone finished him off with a bullet to the head." The room seemed to tilt for a moment, my vision narrowing as the sheriff's words sank in. Carl, gravelly voiced, intense Carl, was dead. Murdered. My mind raced, connecting dots I didn't want to connect. "Jesus," I muttered, running a hand through my hair. "And you think, what? That someone in the group did it?" The sheriff didn't answer right away. He took a slow breath, then said, "I don't know what to think yet, but I do know that Carl was involved in some things that could get a man killed. And I know you were at one of those meetings last week." It wasn't an accusation, not yet, but it was close enough to make me feel like the ground beneath me was crumbling. "I didn't know about any of that," I said, my voice tight. "I just went there because Mike invited me. I didn't even want to go back." "Mike," the sheriff repeated, as if testing the name. "I tried to reach him too. No luck." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with unspoken possibilities. I could see the wheels turning in the sheriff's mind, and I didn't like where they were going. "Look, Sheriff, I don't know what's going on, but I'm not involved in whatever Carl was into. I just came back to fix up my parents' place and figure out what's next for me. I'm not looking for trouble." The sheriff nodded, but his eyes remained hard. "I believe you, Dan, but I also know that trouble has a way of finding people who aren't looking for it." With that, he left, leaving me standing in the middle of my living room, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do, who to trust. Mike was unreachable, Carl was dead, and the sheriff was clearly suspicious of everyone. My quiet return to Warren had turned into something out of a nightmare, and I had no idea how to wake up from it. The hours after the sheriff's visit crawled by, each one heavier than the last. I kept busy, anything to keep my mind from spiraling further into the paranoia that had taken root. But no matter how hard I tried, the questions kept coming. Who had killed Carl? Why? And what was Mike's role in all of this? By evening, the tension had become unbearable. I needed answers, and I needed them now. I decided to drive out to Mike's place, hoping to find him there, hoping to get some clarity. The drive felt longer than usual, the quiet Vermont road stretching out in front of me like some endless, dark ribbon. My headlights cut through the night, but the darkness seemed to press back, as if it was trying to keep me from getting where I was going. When I arrived at Mike's place, I was relieved to see his truck in the driveway. But the relief was short-lived. As I got out of the car, I noticed the front door was slightly ajar, the dim light from inside spilling out onto the porch. My gut told me something was wrong, but I pushed the feeling aside. I had to know what was going on. I walked up to the porch, my steps cautious, each one echoing in the stillness of the night. "Mike!" I called out, but there was no answer. I pushed the door open further, stepping inside. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. The living room was a mess, furniture overturned, papers scattered everywhere. My heart pounded in my chest as I moved further inside, my senses on high alert. It was clear there had been a struggle, but there was no sign of Mike. "Mike!" I called out again, louder this time. Still nothing. I was about to head upstairs when I heard a faint noise coming from the back of the house. It was a low, pained groan, the kind that sends chills down your spine. I followed the sound, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for the door to the back room. What I found on the other side stopped me cold. Mike was there, slumped against the wall, blood seeping from a gash on his forehead. His face was pale, his eyes barely open. He looked up at me, trying to focus, trying to say something, but the words came out as a whisper. "Dan, I'm sorry." I rushed over to him, dropping to my knees. "Mike, what the hell happened? Who did this to you?" He coughed, wincing in pain, and shook his head. You gotta get out of here. They're coming. They know." "Who's coming?" I demanded, panic rising in my chest. "Mike, tell me what's going on." But before he could answer, the sound of tires crunching on gravel outside sent a wave of terror through me. Someone was here, and from the look in Mike's eyes, it wasn't anyone friendly. I looked around, trying to figure out what to do, where to go. We were sitting ducks. "Help me up," Mike groaned, struggling to stand. I grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet as quickly as I could. His legs were shaky, and I had to practically carry him as we moved toward the back door. The sound of footsteps on the porch sent us both into a frenzy of motion, desperate to get out before whoever was coming in could find us. We stumbled out the back door just as the front door burst open. Voices filled the house. Angry, aggressive. I didn't recognize them, but it didn't matter. Whoever they weren't here to help. We made it to the tree line behind Mike's house, ducking into the cover of the woods. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Mike was struggling, his steps faltering, but we couldn't stop now. We had to keep moving. As we pushed deeper into the woods, the voices behind us grew fainter, but I knew we weren't safe yet. Whoever these people were, they were determined, and they wouldn't stop until they found us. "Dan, we can't keep running," Mike gasped, his voice weak. "You need to know. It's not just them. The sheriff, he's involved." I stopped, turning to face Mike, his words sending a fresh wave of dread through me. "What are you talking about?" But before he could answer, a gunshot rang out, echoing through the trees. We both froze, terror gripping us as the realization hit. There was no escape. The gunshot echoed in my ears, reverberating through the silent woods. For a split second, we both stood frozen, the reality of the situation sinking in like a lead weight. Then instinct took over. I grabbed Mike and pulled him further into the trees, our only hope being to put as much distance as possible between us and whoever was out there. Mike was struggling, his breaths coming in short, labored gasps. I could feel the life draining out of him, his strength fading with every step. But there was no time to stop, no time to think. I could hear voices behind us now, closer, more urgent. They were coming, and they were closing in fast. We stumbled through the underbrush, branches tearing at our clothes, the cold night air biting at our skin. Every step was a struggle, every breath a battle against the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. I kept my grip tight on Mike, half carrying him as we pushed deeper into the woods. But I knew we couldn't keep this up. Not for long. As we reached a small clearing, Mike collapsed, his legs giving out beneath him. "Dan, I can't," he wheezed, his voice barely a whisper. I knelt beside him, trying to pull him back to his feet. "We have to keep going, Mike. We can't stop now." But he shook his head, his eyes filled with pain and something else, resignation. "You need to go. Leave me. They won't stop if they find you." "I'm not leaving you," I said through gritted teeth, trying to haul him up again. But he was too heavy, and I was too weak. The exhaustion, the fear, the adrenaline, it was all catching up with me. "Dan, listen to me," Mike said, his hand gripping my arm with surprising strength. "It's not just them. It's bigger than that. Sheriff Coleman. He's in on it. They're all in on it. You need to get out of Warren. Now." His words sent a fresh wave of horror through me. The sheriff? The man who had come to my house, who had looked me in the eye and acted like he was on my side. I felt like the ground was crumbling beneath me, the last shred of stability I had left being torn away. "Why, Mike? Why are they doing this?" I demanded, my voice trembling with desperation. But before he could answer, another gunshot rang out, this one much closer. I dropped to the ground, pulling Mike with me, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The voices were right on top of us now, and I knew we were out of time. "Go," Mike hissed, his grip on my arm tightening. You have to get out of here. Tell someone, tell anyone, but you can't let them find you." I looked at him, torn between the instinct to run and the need to stay, to protect him. But I knew he was right. If I stayed, we were both dead. If I ran, maybe, just maybe, I could get help. I could expose whatever this was. Whatever dark secret was hidden beneath the surface of this town. "Mike, I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I'll come back for you. I promise." With that, I turned and ran, every fiber of my being screaming at me to keep moving, to push through the exhaustion, the fear, the pain. The trees blurred around me as I sprinted through the forest, the sound of voices and footsteps fading behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran, faster than I ever had before, driven by the desperate hope that I might escape, that I might survive to tell the truth. As I burst out of the woods and onto the road, my lungs burning, my vision swimming, I knew this was far from over. Warren was no longer the quiet, safe town I remembered. It was a place of secrets, of darkness, and I had stumbled into the heart of it. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for now, survival was all that mattered. I didn't stop running until I saw the distant lights of a neighboring town. And even then, I knew that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The days following my escape from Warren were a blur of fear, exhaustion, and relentless uncertainty. I made it to the next town, barely coherent, and found refuge in a small motel. I contacted the authorities, told them everything I knew about Carl, Mike, the veterans group, and Sheriff Coleman's involvement. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that things were more complicated than I could have imagined. The local police launched an investigation, but they claimed they found nothing substantial. Mike was never found, and the story of Carl's death was swept under the rug, labeled as a tragic accident with no further details. Sheriff Coleman remained in his position, untouchable, his friendly demeanor unchanged. It was as if nothing had happened, as if I had imagined the whole thing. But I knew better. I could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on me, suffocating me. I was a man without a home, without answers, and without justice. The small town that was supposed to be my refuge had turned into a place of nightmares, and I was the only one who seemed to remember. I couldn't stay in Vermont. The paranoia, the fear, it was too much. I packed up what little I had and moved far away, to a place where no one knew my name, where I could start over. But even here, in the anonymity of a new life, the memories haunt me. Every shadow, every distant footstep, every unexpected knock at the door sends my heart racing, my mind back to those dark woods. I never heard from Mike again, and I doubt I ever will. Sometimes, I wonder if he's out there somewhere, hiding like I am, waiting for the right moment to resurface. But deep down, I know that whatever happened that night, it took more than just his life, it took his soul. As for Warren, Vermont, I haven't been back since. I doubt I ever will. But I keep track of the news from time to time, searching for any hint that the truth might finally come to light. So far, there's been nothing. The town continues on as it always has, quiet, unassuming, and deeply, terrifyingly normal. But I know the darkness that lies beneath that surface, the secrets that remain buried. And I know that it's only a matter of time before someone else stumbles into it, just as I did. When that happens, I can only hope they're stronger than I was, braver than I was, because the darkness in Warren doesn't let go. It clings to you, follows you, haunts you, and I'll carry that darkness with me, wherever I go, for the rest of my life.